We called it Designing Programs Step by Step. And one of the things I realized, every seminar that I do, I fail miserably in my mind at this stage, because we suddenly get there and I realize there's stuff that I like, that I want to do better, that I think is more important, whatever it is, and I don't do a very good job. So we're going to try this again and see how this one works. If you went to, this was actually at Perform Better that he said this in the Rhode Island Summit, but Bruce Nextater, who's a really good track and field coach, extremely well respected in that field. I think probably a lesser known guy in the strength and conditioning world. But threw this quote out, he said the most important thing we do is not write the workout, it's watch the workout. So when we start talking about the idea of program design, what you've got to realize is program design is a little piece of the puzzle, not a big piece of the puzzle in my mind, in terms of, I think some people spend way too much time screwing around with their computer and making it all look pretty and making the Excel sheets look the right way, but they're not doing this part. They're not doing it. Obviously, and you guys are here working. That's not the case in our situation at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning. I think we do a really good job watching the workout. But when you think about staff meetings, I still think we don't do a good enough job watching the workout. I think you can never almost do a good enough job watching the workout in terms of trying to see every set, every kid, every rep. That's not going to happen, but we've got to understand that that's the important thing. The other thing we have to think about is, should we follow professors or coaches? So when you start thinking about program design, I love when people start talking to me about, well, you know, Tudor Bomper says this about periodization, or this guy says this about periodization. You start thinking, no disrespect meant towards someone like Tudor Bomper, who's obviously a brilliant guy, has been around for a really long time. But he's not a coach. He's not someone who's coaching people. So sometimes people will get very into the theoretical periodization stuff, the way that it's supposed to be from the book, and then realize that that just doesn't work. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about when we get kind of to the whiteboard part, is, okay, why is this the way that it is? And very often you get into logistical stuff. This is the logistical reason that we do this versus the maybe theoretical reason that you should be doing X and we're doing Y. Any information should result in small, subtle changes to your program, not a new program. If you watch this 2 hours and you change your whole program, then there's probably some indication that your program wasn't that great to begin with if you were willing to throw out everything that you were doing. But I say that in sort of think, in some cases, I think a lot of people should probably throw out their program. So in some ways, any new information should result in small, subtle changes to your program, not a new program. But the reality of that might be very different. It might be a situation where you look and think, my God, I'm not doing any of these things. We don't warm up. We still do bilateral training. Because it's amazing how many people that you will see who are still at what I would call the like 1970s, 80s era workout of walking into the weight room and starting to lift weights, which when I see that in somebody's programming, I'm like, oh my, you know, it's like, wow, I can't believe that anybody does that anymore. And then you realize that there's actually a lot of people that still do exactly that. Warming up for bench pressing is putting 135 on the bar and warming up for bench pressing. That's the way that they would view it. I think, again, part of our problem is we live in this vacuum of a world where everything gets done really well, and we start to think that that's the way that it is everywhere and realize that it's not. I like this quote from Ron Rusker, same idea, use this information to make your existing program that you're comfortable with better. So hopefully the things that you're going to see will make you think, okay, we can change this, we can change this, this can be better, this can be better. And when we do this, when we start talking about programming, I'm very adamant about the fact that programming is a recipe. And when you think about cooking and recipes, you've got to think about the idea that there's very specific ingredients in very specific amounts and very specific timing. You can't alter recipes. You can't go in and say, I'm going to double this, I'm going to take this out, I'm going to put this in ahead of this. If you do that, you ruin the food. In the cooking world, everybody knows that. I think in the strength and conditioning world, people think that it's just random. Yeah, you know, I'll have people say all the time, yeah, we don't warm up, or we don't foam roll, or we don't do this. And I would look at it and say, well, if you don't, you're missing a critical piece of the recipe. And I try to make the distinction between recipe and menu. It's not a menu. You don't get to pick. You don't look. It's not like you go into a restaurant and think, I'll have that, that, and that. You've got to be able to look at this thing and look more like, okay, I'm looking at a cookbook, and it's going to tell me exactly the ingredients that I need, and then it's going to tell me how much of each ingredient, and then it's going to tell me the order that those ingredients need to go in to make this thing come out right. That's really what we're going to do. People will always say, well, do you know the best way? Like, it's amazing. People will say, well, what's the best way to do whatever? Like, the way we're doing it. If we thought there was a better way, then we wouldn't be doing it the way that we're doing it right now. So what we're going to show you, at least in this snapshot, October of 2015, almost November of 2015, would be our perception of this is the best way to do it. I should skip this, but again, knowing that there's a broad audience out there, when we're thinking about program design, we have to think about this idea of movements, not muscle groups. We have to forget, I always say, if you're watching this right now and you're still doing chest days or back days or leg days, then you got a lot of ground to cover. And this will be really good for you. So if you're watching, this is going to be great. But we're going to talk a lot about movement action, not muscle groups. So we're going to talk about pulling exercises and pushing exercises and hip dominant exercise and knee dominant exercise. There will be very little mention of muscles. You will not hear mention of quadriceps or pectorals or things like that as we go through this. And I like to say is don't try to be safe, try to be simple. I think sometimes safe is probably machine training in the sense that no one will ever get hurt. Sit somebody down in a chair, have them do X number of reps with an isolated muscle group. That's pretty darn safe. Very little bad can happen, but it's not very effective. The other thing is that when you think sometimes, and obviously we're moving out of that stage, which is good, but the idea about safe training, usually I always say safe training means you get hurt in the game. And when you start looking at the number, and it's interesting even looking at NFL right now, looking at the number of ACL tears, looking at the number of Achilles tendon tears, you wonder what people are doing in terms of training, and you think, gee, if this person was on their feet doing what they're supposed to be doing one leg squats, doing plyos, doing everything the way they're supposed to do, would they be getting hurt at the rate that they're doing, or is the programming that bad? It makes me curious. The other thing you need to think about is we're going to talk a lot about functional anatomy. I'm not going to spend too much time on functional anatomy now because we're going to get there. The other thing you have to talk about, and particularly because this is going to Iceland, I know that there is a massive number of CrossFits in Iceland. Actually, I forget the number, but someone told me that just in Reykjavik alone there's like 10 or 12 or 14 CrossFits in just the one town in Iceland. So there's, tons. When we think about intensity, we've got to look at sort of, I like to go through these two, there's sort of two varying thoughts. CrossFit, hard as you can. The corrective exercise idea, never do anything hard. You're always, everything's easy and everything's about activation and everything's about getting the right muscles firing and all that stuff. What we want to really do is find ourselves somewhere in the middle of these two things. We don't want to be on one end, we don't want to be on the other end. So we have to look from a CrossFit standpoint, is training to failure or beyond failure safe? I'm going to sit up here and say, no, it's not. I don't think, and particularly when we talk about the training beyond technical failure, and we're going to distinguish technical failure. When you say, I can't do another rep with the technique that I want to do that rep with, that's when the set terminates. That would not probably be acceptable in the CrossFit world. It would be, I can't do another rep, sort of no matter what it looks like or no matter how I get it there. The other thing that CrossFit, people will tell you stuff like, injuries are part of training. If you're going to train hard, you're going to get injured. I just don't believe that. I don't think that that's part of training. I don't think anybody should ever get injured training. I would consider any injury in training to be a failure on our part, coach's part. Yes, are people going to get hurt? Yeah, people are going to get hurt. Are accidents going to happen? Yes, accidents are going to happen. Yes, are people going to pull muscles? Yep, all that stuff's going to happen. But I would not look at any of that stuff and consider it to be in the acceptable category, like, oh, that's okay. That's, stuff happens. The other thing from a CrossFit standpoint, I always say, do adults make good Olympic lifters? I think those of us that are sitting in the room have been here at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning and would probably all come to the agreement that adults don't make good Olympic lifters. They're too much water under the bridge. The ability of most adults to get both arms simultaneously over their head is compromised. They're not, and if they can't do that, they're going to have a great deal of difficulty. If you have someone who can't front squat, can't get something over their head, they're going to have a great deal of difficulty in a CrossFit style workout. The other thing, and this is a lot more interesting, I looked this up, and this I'll probably get, at some point, the hate mail will start coming in, but if you look up, I just looked up cults. Now, I did not look up CrossFit. I looked up cult behavior on the internet, and I copied and pasted this. And if you read it, The group displays excessively zealous and unquestioning commitment to its leader and regards his belief system, ideology, and practices as the truth, as law. Check. Right? Questioning, doubting, and dissent are discouraged or even punished. Check. The leadership dictates, sometimes in great detail, how members should think, act, and feel. For example, leaders prescribe what types of clothes to wear. Check. High socks. Right? Okay? The group is elitist, claiming a special exalted status. The elite's right in there, forging elite fitness, right? Elite, exalted status for itself, its leaders, and the members of the group. Has a polarized us versus them mentality, which may cause conflict with wider society. Check. The leader is not accountable to any authorities. Check. The group teaches or implies that its supposedly exalted ends justify whatever means it deems necessary. Check. Right? I mean, it's crazy when you go through this and realize this is talking just about cult behavior within the world, and that you can, leadership induces feelings of shame or guilt in order to influence or to control members. Check. Group is preoccupied with bringing in new members. Check. Group is preoccupied with making money. Check. Members are expected to devote inordinate amounts of time to the group and group-related activities. Check. Members are encouraged or required to live and or socialize only with other group members. I'd say encouraged. Check. Maybe not required. So we'd have to look at that and think, maybe there's something a little bit cultish about this whole thing. Where are we? I want to feel like we're in the middle. I always say, when people say, because it's amazing how many people will say something to the effect of, oh, you guys are just like CrossFit. Because if someone came in here and really was uneducated, they might look at what we did and think, it's just like CrossFit. I see people doing interval training. People are riding the assault bikes. People are running up and down. People are doing total body strength training. And people say, yeah, you're just like CrossFit. And I always tell them we're just like CrossFit, but not quite as dumb. So we want to be in the middle. We want to be, we don't want to be at one end. We don't want to be at this corrective exercise end where nobody lifts weights, where nobody gets stronger, where nobody does anything hard. We also don't want to be at the other end where it's how hard can you do it and everything else be damned. Don't worry about technique. Don't worry about any of that stuff. Just get it done. So I'd like to think that we fall in that mid-ground. And we've got to realize that mid-ground's a good place to be a lot of times. Everything's going to be a continuum. We're going to be looking, and that continuum is going to be different depending on who we're dealing with. So we might look like this continuum is basically power. Olympic lifts, swings, jumps. And we might look at this and think, well, maybe we want to be in the middle. And for our adult clients, we're in the middle. For our athlete clients, we're out closer to the risk end, and we're doing Olympic lifting. And we might be up here just, like baseball, my baseball guys, multi-million-dollar guys, they're at the high benefit end. They're just jumping. They're not doing swings. They're not doing Olympic lifts. They're going to get their power work primarily from med balls and plyo. So I think we've got to see that everything's a continuum, and we've got to figure out for the given audience, where do we fit on that particular continuum, and can we balance risk and benefit? And if you watch Functional Strength Coach 5, this slide's in there. And there's probably a lot of slides actually that are in there. But I think the thought process is going to be different. But the big thing is looking and saying, okay, can risk and benefit balance? And in some cases, if I want more benefit, I have to take more risk. If I'm going to be looking at benefit and think, okay, that's got, it's got a lot of weight in there. Okay, I've got to take more risk to tilt that scale. That's the kid who's trying to make it to the pros. But if I look at a guy who's already playing in the pros, now I've got to be really careful to balance that scale, because what's the benefit to that guy? You can't say, oh, you're going to play in the pros. He's going to be, I'm already doing that. Well, you might make $1 million. I already make $1 million. So when you think of the additional benefits to that guy, the additional benefit on that side is, well, you might make more money than you're making now. Okay, now we're talking. So how much risk do I want to take with that guy versus how much risk do I want to take with, say, an 18-year-old kid who's at college and is thinking, I might be able to play in the NHL. I think there's a really big difference. So we've got to be able to look at that as we go through it. We've got to think about technique. How shitty is too shitty? How do we balance effort and technique? Because again, it's not unlike that CrossFit idea. Yeah, you're going to see some reps where you're going to think, oh, I didn't really love that rep. And then you've got to look at that and think, okay, what do I do next set? Do I lower the weight? Do I make a coaching point? Do I let that go because I think, okay, it wasn't too shitty? And that's Kevin's question, but Kevin, I think, has brought that up a bunch of times in staff meetings. Sometimes you look and think, okay, at what point? When we're talking about the middle school, high school kids out here, you want it to be perfect. You want to keep working all the time, trying to get it perfect, trying to get it perfect, trying to get it perfect. When you get some of these college kids, that are getting ready to go to college in 2 weeks, you might look at that and think, okay, I'm going to let that go. When you watch, and you'll see some of the videos, there'll be some videos here of the Olympic girls doing some stuff, and you'll realize, okay, technique-wise, I don't like that last rep. I don't like those last 2 reps. But you let it go. It's actually warmer here than I thought, so I'm going to take the sweatshirt off. But we've got to be thinking about this idea of how do we balance effort and technique? How do we not end up in this, hey, we just do corrective exercise and no one tries hard? And then the kind of opposite situation of everybody's trying really hard, but it looks like shit. We've got to be able to make that distinction. This is my favorite slide. That's dog shit in my driveway.
The picture quality is fantastic.
Yeah, it really is. That's the new iPhone 5. No, actually, it's the old iPhone 5. But you know, the point being, shit looks like shit. It's not that hard for us from a coaching standpoint to be able to look at something and think, nope, I didn't like that. I need to fix that. I need to make that better. And then again, continuing, where do we fit? You know, young athletes, I like to use the analysis, you know, the filet mignon versus beef jerky analogy, which I think is pretty good when you start thinking about tissue quality. Young athletes are like filet mignon. They're hard to hurt, which is a good thing. You can get a couple of bad reps and it's probably not costing you as much as it sometimes in that adult group. If you got one bad rep at a high load, if we were doing, let's just say, we decided we were going to do triples in the trap bar deadlift like we would do with our summer groups, we might have some of that beef jerky that breaks down on us. And, you know, you get people walking out going, you know, that wasn't very good. Whereas even with the kids, sometimes you'll have a kid who'll come in one day, hey, my back was sore. He'd come in the next day and be like, I'm fine. And I feel like I can deadlift again. And that isn't always the best decision either. But you've got to constantly be making that decision as you're designing that program. What's the risk? What's the benefit? And then we always talk about this, know your audience. Who are you training? What sport do they play? I love Marco Cardinale's quote. I think it's been every talk I've done since I heard Marco talk. Your sport is not different, you just think it is. One thing you'll realize, no matter where you are, no matter who you work with, there'll be somebody there coaching-wise that will tell you, well, it's totally different because it's soccer. Or it's totally different because it's track. Or it's totally different because it's football. And one thing I think that you guys, you know, the audience right here watching right now versus the people that are watching on video, realizes that you don't see much difference. What we're doing really isn't changing very significantly from one group to the next. And I think when we get to the specifics, people will look at it and think, yeah, it probably shouldn't change. But I said, that's your target audience right there, gamer. Seated. I just like these slides, so I keep using them. Right? Computers got smaller, people got bigger. TVs got thinner, people got thicker. They're just good slides. So one of the things when we start thinking about, I went back to this idea of standards, and I love, Dan John has great lines, but he talks about his standard. And you start thinking, okay, what strength matters, but how do we define strong? So I think one thing as we start looking at this is saying, okay, how do we define strong? We used to define strong based on things that we knew, squat, bench, deadlift. We'd look and say, okay, if the person can squat this much, they're strong. If they can deadlift this much, they're strong. If they can bench press this much, they're strong. And I don't know how sport-specific that is when you start looking at athletes and then trying to define their strength based on these sort of powerlifting type tests. But for a long time, that was all we had. So that was what we tended to do. And I just republished this article that I wrote a while ago for T-Nation, the title exactly, How Strong is Strong. And one of the things that I said is if I said, okay, you know, what's strong for a 200-pound guy in the bench press, people would probably say, well, you know, if he can bench press 300 pounds, he's strong. Everybody in here would probably have an answer for that particular question based on their level of experience. And most of those answers probably would be fairly accurate and fairly reasonable. But if I then said, well, what should that person split squat? How many chin-ups should they be able to do? What should they clean? You might not have necessarily as much data. So one of the things that we looked at, and I really started to look at this hard my last couple of years at BU, your bench 1 rep max should equal your chin-up 1 rep max, should equal your hang clean 1 rep max, should equal your split squat 1 rep max. So if we just took a number, if we projected out, like we just took an RM chart and projected out those numbers, they should all be pretty close. Chin-up's harder to figure out because you have to figure out, you've got to take body weight plus external load. So you've got to figure out, so if I'm 180 and I use a 50-pound plate, then I got to be 230. If I do 230 for 5, okay, what does that make my 1 RM? It probably makes it 265. But if that's true, then I should be able to bench 265. I should be able to hang clean 265, and I should be able to split squat 265. So again, 265, that probably means I should be able to do the hundreds for 10 in the split squat. Then I'm going to tell you, yeah, that person's strong. And that person is well-rounded, and that person's injury potential is probably going to be fairly low, because we know this because we've done it and we've seen the injury potential come down when we develop this type of balance. If you look at this and say, I got a guy who can bench 400, but he can do 1 chin-up and he can hang clean 250, you're like, ooh, that's not very good. This guy's all out of whack because he's a really good presser, he's a really bad puller, and his power output stinks, right? And that's the kind of stuff that we've got to be able to look at. So males, bench press 1.25 to 1.5 times body weight, which basically means 250 to 300 at 200. That would be reasonable. Then you realize hang clean, about the same, 250 to 300 at 200 pounds. Split squat, 1.25 times body weight times for 10 reps. And then you got to divide it by in half, thinking you got a dumbbell in each hand. Chin up, same thing, 1.25 to 1.5 times body weight. When you start thinking body weight plus external load. And that's just that and that are exactly the same. There's no difference. Think about females. I started looking at females, say, well, what about the Olympic girls? Where do they fall in this? It's probably like bench press 90% of their body weight for 5, which means, again, hang clean, 90% of their body weight for 5. Chin up, basically 25 pounds of external load for 5. Split squat, basically body weight for 10. If you start figuring that out, it's all going to come out in about that same category when we start thinking about what's standard, how strong is strong, how strong should my athletes be when I start looking at these people. Because that's the biggest thing, I think, when you evaluate. If you look at your athletes and you think everybody's falling in these categories, you're probably going to be pretty healthy. If they're not, if you look and think, wow, we're way out of whack in terms of our bench presses are way higher than our cleans, that shows you where there's a big hole in your program. I think if you came to me and said all our cleans are higher than our bench press, I'd high five you and we'd all leave and have a beer. But usually you're going to find it's the bench press one that's way out of whack, and it's way out of whack in terms of it's over higher. So if we look, and this you guys have seen Michaela, but this now, and she's 15, I think, in this clip, might even be 14 in this clip. But she's strong. 140 for 6. If we figured out body weight wise, it's probably right in that 90% body weight range, right? This is Alex Carpenter. And this is on the high end. She's basically, this will be pretty, with her, this is pretty close to body weight for 9. That's strong. You won't see, in general, you say you won't see a lot of females do this, but in here you will. It will not be unusual if you watch our Olympic group. Most of the girls now are getting 5 reps at 135. They're in that 90% or more of their body weight for 5 reps. Alex is exceptional in terms of her strength level. But the nice thing about her, she just set the all-time scoring record at BC. So, you know, some people say, oh, it doesn't matter. Well, I think she just got her 100th goal as a college hockey player, so it's not hurting her skill level any. Same thing here, and this is Alex again. But this effectively is about 200 for 7. Because I started trying to figure out, she's probably around 155, 160 pounds, somewhere in that neighborhood. So with 45-pound weight, she's at about 200. So when we start thinking strong, and if you look at, like, you know, Smelka sitting over there to Mike Vaughn's right, you know, she's probably heavier, taller than Alex, and is still probably in like the 35 for 5 kind of territory. So these are not, the good thing here, she's a little bit of an outlier, but she's not a significant outlier when you look at that group of girls. Again, if you look at Megan, oh, that's interesting. And this is one of the more impressive things that I've seen in terms of, she's going to bang out 10 really easy split squats at 160. Those are the 36 kilo kettlebells. Same way, Charlie Coyle. Charlie plays for the Minnesota Wild right now. 280. Charlie benches around 280, 290. Strong. This is Charlie split squatting. And here he's probably, oh, sorry. On the high side. And again, this was as we were kind of refining this test. So I would tell you that these are a little bit high, which is why now we started to kind of go with those risers and play with things a little bit more. But the important thing to see here is he's going to do 240. He's got 120s, which was the heaviest dumbbells that we had. And he's going to do 17 reps. Charlie's pretty strong. And he's still, I think he would only be a senior in college right now. Because I think he left, I think he only stayed part of his freshman year at BU. But he might be 23, maybe. But in that video, he's 18 years old in that clip. This is Ed Lippy, who most of you guys don't know, but this ends up being 315 for 3. Because he's got 3 45-pound plates. But the important thing to understand is you look at both, as you can see, like the male example, the female example, and the idea that, okay, now I think one of the things that we've been able to do in the last 5 years is kind of either define and or redefine what strong is and take it out of the realm of squat, bench, deadlift kind of stuff and look at this and say, okay, yes, we're still thinking about bench press, but we're looking at hand clean, and we've got a power, we've got a pulling measurement in there, and we've got a unilateral strength measurement in there, which suddenly now, at least if you start thinking, hey, I want to profile my guys or my girls, gives you a much better opportunity to really profile them and look and think, is my program doing what I want it to do? Is it taking me where I think it should take me? Because that's going to be really important. In any case, the formula doesn't really change. If you see after it says, or does it? It changes every once in a while. It changes slowly. Some people would look at this and say, well, it's totally different than it used to be. And in my mind, I'd say, no, it's not. But now I've had I don't know what the word is, the opportunity, I guess, to rewrite Functional Training for Sports, which I wrote in 2004, and realized that, yeah, when I wrote what started out as the second edition of that book, it became a whole new book because there's a lot of stuff that had actually changed. So the formula does change, but it changes slowly. I think it changes as we learn. As we learn and realize, okay, here's a piece of the recipe that needs to be slightly altered, we alter it, hoping that the final end product that we're making is always going to taste good. We're never going to alter that recipe to the point where we look and think, now we don't like what the end product is. So for us, if you think roll, stretch, breathe, warm up, breathe, do your core work, do your lift. That part doesn't really change very much. If we look at that in a simpler say, we're going to start with tissue quality first, then we're going to go to tissue length, then we're going to do something for tissue temperature, tissue innovation, tissue mobility, then we're going to work on the strength of that tissue. So if you look at it strictly as a muscle tissue standpoint. Ideas will overlap. Correctives, we could look at correctives and say, sometimes the correctives are in the rolling, sometimes the correctives are in the stretching, sometimes the correctives are in the warm-up. I think this is the corrective part sometimes is where we get screwed up because we have, I think sometimes strength coaches maybe either wishing they were a physical therapist or masquerading as physical therapists or whatever it is, and realizing that at some point, and hopefully a big point, we are strength and conditioning coaches, and the basic job is to get the person stronger, and the job is to get the person in better condition. We need to do that respecting the formula, respecting the recipe, respecting the sequence with this idea that, hey, this is a process that has a lot of moving parts to it. But ultimately, if you're not going back and looking at those standards and thinking, am I getting better? Am I starting to meet those standards? Then what you're doing isn't working. And I think that's where a lot of times people fail, is that they don't look enough from the end result standpoint and say, is what I'm doing working? And we've done this. The good thing for me is, having been either in college sports or professional sports really up until the last 2 years, it was really easy to measure. You could look at health and you could look at records and be able to think, okay, are we winning and are we healthy? If we're winning and we're healthy and the numbers are where they should be, we're doing the right thing. If maybe my numbers were great but we weren't healthy, we're not doing the right thing. If my numbers were great and we weren't healthy and we weren't winning, we're probably not doing the right thing. I always think bad strength coaches like to tell you that strength coaches don't matter. People will tell you, well, you can't affect win-loss records. I would 100% disagree. And I will tell you, when we first really got our strength program rolling at Boston University in like the probably late 80s, early 90s, there was one year where we were like in the top 5 for the Sears Trophy. I think 95 actually, because we won the national championship in ice hockey. And we had a bunch of other teams that had done really well. The Sears Trophy is the top Division I athletic program in the country. And BU was in the top 5 that year. And I would look at it and think, no, strength and conditioning did impact a lot of those teams. It impacted football. We were in the 1AA playoffs. It impacted hockey. We won the national championship. And we were, we had a really broad spectrum. We had field hockey. We had a basketball team that made the NCAA tournament. We had a lot, we had a lot of really good teams at that time. And I don't think that it was in any small part due to the fact that we had a really good strength and conditioning program. Our kids were strong, our kids were fast, and our kids were healthy. So I think it does make a difference, and it can make a really, really big difference. So this is the part we talk about now, program design. So if we start analyzing programs, because, and I always say I do a bad job of this because it took me 40 minutes to get here, as it always does. But we've got to look at programs and say, because again, people will always want, okay, what's the ideal? The ideal is 4-day. The ideal is what we do in the summer. But then people would say, well, you do something that's less optimal all year round. And I would say, yes, we do. We do either 3-day or 2-day because, again, we talk about being realistic and respecting logistics. We're not going to be able to get kids to train 4 days a week in the school year. It's not realistic. We used to really push for 3 days. We used to really, really push the kids. You got to come 3 days. We had a lot more kids in here on Friday. We had a lot more kids here on Saturday. I think we've realized over time from a business standpoint that that's not practical. It's really hard for parents to get kids here. It's really hard for kids to balance the academic things that they have to do, the practices that they have to do. For a lot of these kids, a great deal of them are juggling 2 sports. When you look at some of these kids, we've got kids that are here for, let's say, Austin Prep hockey kids who are also juggling baseball while they're juggling their preparation for Austin Prep hockey. So they're kind of in a baseball off-season mode, going and hitting and throwing, and then they're in a hockey preseason mode and they're playing in a league at least 1 day a week. And then they're also here in a strength and conditioning mode where they're training 2 days a week. So I think we've made compromises. We made compromises because you have to make compromises, unfortunately. It's part of the deal. Much the same way. It's interesting, even with the Red Sox, we'd have guys who'd start spring training. I want to work out 4 days a week. And I'd always be like, okay, great. 3 weeks into spring training, they'd be down to 2 days a week. Because guys would come in, they'd be all excited, all fired up. I've been doing great, off season's going great. But once they start going out every day and going to practice every day and they start playing preseason games in spring training, all of a sudden they realize, I need to get back to 2 days a week. And it goes very quickly. Usually it's 4 days, and then it's 3 days, and then it's 2 days. Might be 4 days for the first 2 or 3 weeks, and after a while I realize, okay, I'm just going to let these guys do it. If they want 4 days, I'll take the 4-day program out, we'll train 4 days, and then in relatively short order they'll come to me and say, I think we got to cut back to 3, and then in relatively short order they'll say, I think I got to cut back to 2. Because it's almost like their body will tell them what they in fact need to do. This is really interesting because I took pictures of these because we had a really good session with the mentorship group and a really good session with the Taiwanese group talking about program design. And it all ended up being all whiteboard stuff. And I thought, wow, I got to make sure I don't lose these whiteboards. The cool thing is actually a couple of them are still up in here. Are we wide enough so that they can see that one over there too?
I can get it over there.
Yeah. Because the good thing about this is if we start looking at this idea, and this doesn't matter, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, it doesn't matter if we're talking about a 4-day program, a 3-day program, or a 2-day program. This part is not going to change. Phase 1 is going to be a base program. And I could probably spend a half an hour talking about hypertrophy. I hate when people say a hypertrophy phase, because hypertrophy in my mind is total bullshit. in the sense that, like, Steve Bigelow's goal is to gain 5 pounds. Well, Steve, just get in a hypertrophy program, you'll gain 5 pounds, right? No, he won't just gain 5 pounds, because that's not the way that it works. Whereas if I looked at Joe, and obviously you guys that are looking at the camera, watching this don't see it, but Steve's more ectomorphic body type, Joe's more mesomorphic body type. Joe's going to have an easy time gaining that 5 pounds. Steve's going to have a really hard time gaining that 5 pounds. What I do in that base phase is not going to change that greatly. So I would prefer to look at that as simply saying it's an accumulation phase, it's an anatomical adaptation phase, it's a base phase, it's not a hypertrophy phase, simply because I say we're going to do slightly more reps, we're going to have a slight increase in volume, doesn't mean that suddenly people are going to get big. And we can show that. And I don't know if I think I have it at a different spot. Yeah, I do. But I'm going to pull this up because it's actually pretty interesting, and I'm going to go back, because when you talk about sort of hypertrophy and you talk about what's going on, Casey Bellamy, who's one of our Olympic girls, is a perfect example of how this really doesn't work. And we've seen it over and over again. Let's see, I'm hoping I can remember where I would have put this in. Because in Casey's case, she's been here for 5 years. She has not gained any weight. She was 5 years ago, she was 142 pounds. And this year at Lake Placid, when we tested, she was 142 pounds. And nothing, I say nothing changed, everything changed. She's significantly stronger, significantly more powerful. But yet, let's see if we can see this. No, it's not going to be. Sorry, I want to take the time to pull this up because it's well worth seeing from a statistical standpoint. And if it's not here, then I'm going to know I need to add it right in at that spot, and I'm going to go find it anyway. But okay. So if you look at here, 2010, 142 pounds, 19% body fat, 19.5-inch vertical jump, benched 115 for 3, and did 6 bodyweight chin-ups. 2015. 142 pounds, 15.8% body fat, so she dropped 3% body fat. So effectively, she's gained 4.5 pounds of muscle, 27.5-inch vertical jump, 135 for 5, 25 pounds for 5 chin-ups. Now, when you look at that, she's been through a whole bunch of hypertrophy phases, quote unquote. Why didn't she hypertrophy? And then some people say, well, because it's a female, and they'll make up all these excuses for why, but the reality is I think that the whole hypertrophy training thing is really a function of drugs. So I think what happens is you get people who will look at these things and say, oh yeah, this is the hypertrophy phase because that's the way it's supposed to be. And that's we go back to the book idea. Okay, well, in the book, they say that phase 1's a hypertrophy phase. You do more volume, you do higher reps, and you get bigger. No, I mean, the people that are supposed to get bigger get bigger. The people that aren't supposed to get bigger don't. And the worst part is the ectomorph probably gets smaller because their body is telling you. So if you're training basketball players and people of that kind of body type, people with small bones, thin wrist, they're probably going to go in this higher volume phase, and they're probably going to get smaller and weaker. So you'll realize that it's not at all what the book tells you. So that's, I guess, like I said, I could talk for half hour and I won't, but I would just tell you, be careful here, realize that it's anatomical adaptation. And the article I always steer everybody to is an old Charles Poliquin article called Variety. It's written two different times, one called Variety in Strength Training, one called 5 Steps to Improving Your Football Strength Program. They're the exact same article. They're actually on that strengthcoach.com site. If guys are interested, you can go on strengthcoach.com and just type in Poliquin in the search, and underneath you can click. It'll ask you to click like headlines, body, authors. If you click authors, it'll come up because it's the only Poliquin article that's on there. But what Poliquin did, and I think it was brilliant, is he said, basically, accumulation phases have more volume, intensity phases have more intensity. And all we've ever done here, so when we start talking about program design, we simply alternate accumulation and intensification. But I'm not going to tell you that more volume is going to produce more hypertrophy. And I'm going to tell you to be really careful with the amount of volume that you're going to do in that quote-unquote pursuit of hypertrophy. And I'm going to tell you that you've got to realize that hypertrophy will be directly related to the type of responder that you get. And that's where sometimes when you're dealing with football people, if you've got these mesomorphic football guys, they're going to, you get the guys who come in, and every time they lift, you ever work out with that guy, he feels like he got bigger. Like today, he got bigger. And then you look at some other people and think, he's been in there breaking his ass, and he eats right, he does everything he's supposed to do, and he hasn't gained any size at all. That's where you realize there's a really huge genetic, it's not a programming thing. It's a genetic thing. We've got to be respecting genetics and realize that the person who's struggling, like if I get someone like Steve, I'm probably going to tell Steve to do less. Eat more, do less. Really concentrate on getting stronger, really concentrate on progressive resistance exercise, but keep the volume really, really low. Like he'd be a one heavy set guy in my world. But the idea, so phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Base phase, 8s. As we said, peak volume, if we look at that, generally would be 24 reps because we're going to measure volume by the number of reps that we're going to do in the major exercises that we're going to do, right? So for us, the reality is if we look at here, week 1, and actually did I put it on that one? No, it's not on that one. So if I looked at down here and said, okay, week 1 might be 16 reps because it might just be 2 sets of 8. Because I like this anatomical adaptation part. If I start, so for instance, we started our baseball guys the other day. We started with 2 sets of 8 because I know I don't want these guys to be sore. I'm not looking, when I start phase 1, I'm not looking for hypertrophy. I'm looking for anatomical adaptation. I really like that term. And anatomical adaptation means that their anatomy adapts, right? I don't want to, I don't want to body slam their anatomy. I don't want to be in a situation, I always said, when we have that first week, I tell the guys the same thing all the time. Tomorrow, you should get up and be like, yeah, I worked out. You should not get up and think, oh my God, I feel like I got a stick shoved up my ass and I can't move, right? So, there's no point in doing that in that first phase, in that base phase, and it's actually stupid. So you've got to think of, this base phase, the volume probably goes 16, 24, 24, right? And then when we think, okay, phase 2, intensification. What does intensification mean? It means the workout gets more intense. The loads get heavier. Correspondingly, if we think about the idea of volume and intensity should basically be like that, right? If volume is coming down, intensity is going up. Pretty simple when we're thinking about designing workouts. And the reality is that the workouts should look like that, right? With these opposite waves of volume and intensity. Obviously not, that's probably a bit of a drastic, if we looked at it, it wouldn't be quite that drastic, but that's the basic idea when we look at volume and intensity. But if we look at here, peak volume was 24 reps. Now if we look at here, if I'm doing 5s and I'm saying 3 sets of 5 or 3 sets of 3, the volume now is going to be somewhere between 9 and 15. So the volume will be somewhere around 60% to 30%, give or take, if we wanted to round it off. I guess 3 9s are 27, so maybe a little bit different, right? Phase 3, you go back to accumulation. The difference here, how do I accumulate more volume? And that's where you can look at, I can do eccentrics, I can do isometrics, I can simply go back to this phase. And that would, in fact, satisfy my basic requirement. I could just simply go 8, 5, 8. For us, we tend, like particularly in our summer programs, we tend to not do that when we're talking about program design. We might be looking at 8 and then 5. And then here, we might say, well, actually, we're going to stay with 5s. We might stay with 3s, but because of the eccentric, and that's where you get into the whole time under tension idea. I'm not a huge time under tension guy, but I think you can look at this and realize that in this third accumulation phase, there are going to be different ways that you can accumulate volume. So I could do 3 4 up, 4 down chin-ups, and I'd accumulate some volume. Because I'd get at least, I'd get about 25 seconds minimum of time under tension during that one set. That would be significantly more than I'd get in a set of 8. Like if I think, and this is the other thing that I think people don't do, is they don't time, like what I started to do when we started looking at time under tension is I actually started timing sets and timing reps and looking at them and saying, okay, how long does a rep take? How long does a set of 8 take? One of the things I realized, one, was that if you went out right now and watched, you'd realize that our tempo is very much 1-1 at best. And it might even be 0.5, 0.5, even with control. Like without people dropping the bar and without people bouncing bars, you're probably going to look at, an 8 rep set for the average kid here is probably going to take somewhere between 8 seconds and 16 seconds. 16 on the very high side. 8 probably, you're probably going to see 10 seconds average. So when you're thinking about time under tension in that first phase, one set is going to produce 10 seconds, 12 seconds of time under tension. So the only reason I say that is if I want to get more volume, and I said, okay, 4 up, 4 down, 3 reps, that's 24 seconds at least. Without any transitions built in there, it's probably more like 26 seconds if we're just trying to be. That's significantly more volume than I would have got in that first phase. It's also significantly more stress. I like those things in phase 3 because last thing I want to do is eccentric work in phase 1. But then you'd look at it and say, yeah, but we do that. And we do, and we'll go by. There'll be a point where we'll talk about logistics and we'll explain that, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So does that make sense? Everybody understands that? Like base phase, why? This is why we're doing what we're doing here. So weekly volume and intensity increases, we can actually work off of this. And as we showed, week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5, week 6, you can look at all this stuff. 16, 24, 24, 15, 15, 15. Intensity, weight on the bar goes up, volume goes down. We can use different examples, like we said, phase 3, complex contrast training, eccentric, isometric, some sort of mixed. This is what, Poliquin calls it in his article. I think he calls it mixed accumulation, which I like. And then you start thinking about, and actually, well, I can erase this now because even if I'm doing this, right, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, then I've got to look at the second part of this and say, where am I? Right, because if we look it up here, off season, preseason, in season. This is another one of these things where when you look at the theoretical periodization book, they're all usually written for Olympic sports, and they all usually peak. And then you realize, well, gee, now let's use doesn't matter. Let's use college ice hockey. College ice hockey in season, October 1 through April 1. Houston, we have a problem, right? Because suddenly you realize, now let's make this professional baseball in season, right? So now we're talking about February 15th through October 1. That suddenly makes these periods not very significant, right? In both of these cases. And even now, let's look at, bold subdivision football, right? Bold subdivision football. Let's just say August 1 through January 1. We've suddenly got all these what we would call very non-traditional models that we're trying to work in, and we're trying to apply this conventional periodization idea. What you've got to realize is I need to periodize that. I need to periodize in season. The same way that I'd periodize this. Obviously different volumes. I might be looking at this off season and saying, okay, that's why I said that's really easy. 4-day, easy, easy, easy. No problem. Here, 2-day, but I can't do the same thing. I can't do the same thing every day for 2 days a week for 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, 9 months, right? I've still got to periodize that program and realize that there has to be some movement of volume and intensity during that in-season program. Because if you look, right, what do they used to say? In-season maintenance. I mean, do you really want to maintain for 6 to 7 to 8 to 9 months out of the year? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's why I think the in-season maintenance idea, it's another thing that's a dumb idea. If you're a football strength coach, you bring in a bunch of freshmen who don't have a lot of experience in the weight room, and you say, okay, well, you get here and we're going to go on a maintenance program for the next 6 months. You wasted 6 months. You wasted the first 6 months of their freshman year, right? We always said our freshmen, incoming freshmen, red shirts, went on a 4-day program once school started. As soon as camp was over, we were on a 4-day lifting program. So they would basically lift every day of the week because it just made sense. You know, we lifted on Sunday, so they would lift like Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, just like it was off season because it was. They don't play. So, and that's where I think you've got to always be looking at kind of the traditional stuff that we're getting from the traditional periodization book and then look at that and say, okay, how realistic is that? How experienced is my group? Should I really have a maintenance program? Like the Shamrock Girls, a good example, my daughter's team. Should some of these girls who've never lifted weights before be on an in-season maintenance program? Because we started playing games. We started playing games Labor Day weekend. And, you know, I had one girl that could bench 45 pounds and do 0 chin-ups. Okay, I definitely want to maintain that. I'd like you, when the season is over, I'd like you to still be able to bench 45 pounds and do 0 chin-ups. That would not be aspirational as a coach, right? So we've got to look at that and realize there may be some people, like I'd look at like my juniors and seniors at BU were on a maintenance program. But what I realized is the maintenance program is a very aggressive strength program. If I want that guy to have 90% of his strength when the season is over, I got to make him work. If I don't, so, you know, I might let, you know, if you just take that guy, you know, and said, okay, you know, he's a 300 guy across the board, right? You know, bench, hang clean, chin up, whatever it is. If he does 90%, he's 270. Most of the time we found if that guy trains really hard all season, he loses about 10% of his strength even while he's trying not to. If I put him on a maintenance program, he'll lose more than that. He might lose, because again, if you start thinking about, you know, like I love to put numbers to things. 90% of 300 is 270. You know, if I looked at a guy like, if we, you know, and that's why I use bench press numbers because it's easy for people to understand. But if I looked at you guys and said, yeah, I just want you to maintain, you know, stay at 80%. That would mean if you went into the season benching 300, you'd come out benching 240. If you came out benching 240, it would be very difficult for me to get you stronger the next year, because I would spend that entire off-season time trying to get back from 240 to 300. It's not like you're going to wake up someday and think, oh yeah, you know, the season's over, I can bench 300 again. No, that's not the way that it would work. You'd be a 240 bencher and you'd need to reacquire those 60 pounds that you lost. If I can go in here at 90 or at 95 or, you know, in a perfect world at 100, like I'd look at this and think, you know, 100%, that's good. If I can come out of the season at the same numbers that I went into the season, then we've got a really good chance for that person to make progress over the 4-year time period. Because now when I get to off-season, I can actually expect that person to get stronger. So we've got to look at all these ideas and realize that all the shit that we get in the book, a lot of times isn't very good. It's not well thought out. No one sat and thought. I always say people in the book didn't put numbers to things, right? So when you start looking at this, you realize, like I said, you know, preseason, you know, we're going to shift to more muscle endurance, more energy system work. Because now really that preseason period is the period, okay, I got to get ready to play the sport. And that could generally be, maybe that's a month before the season starts, right? And that would be one of those like Ditko on the radio, you know what I mean? They're going to be like, who's that? They may not get that in Iceland. That's okay. And so again, you realize, but you lose that preseason phase in some ways, particularly depending on the sport. Baseball. Guys, you know, the throwing ramps up, the hitting ramps up. There's all these things, there's all these other confounding variables that you're going to deal with as you go through this process. So when you start thinking about program design, you just have to realize it's, you know, because again, the old, like, this is the old model down the bottom, hypertrophy, strength, power, right? If you read like the Stone, Garhammer type stuff, they're going to say, oh, you first, you know, you do your hypertrophy work, and then you do your strength work, then you do your power work. And I look at it and think, wrong, or wrong, right, probably wrong. Because they'd say, oh, you want to do power work, so, you know, this would be like in the old linear periodization. They'd actually increase the load and decrease the reps again and say that you're going to train for power. But we'd realize power is speed of movement oriented. When we think about power, we train for power all the time. And this, again, when the books will tell you stuff like, you know, you can't do plyos unless you've got a strength base. They'll, you know, they just tell you all kinds of silly things. But I look at it and think, we've got to be training for power all the time. And we're going to spend, well, actually, again, I won't get ahead of myself because power is a big part as we move forward. And then the other thing you start thinking about is just the variation within phase. You know, we could just simply say, okay, we're going to dumbbell bench all 3 phases. And we might just do dumbbell bench for 3 sets of 8 bilateral. Boom, both arms move at the same time. We might simply say, okay, now we're going to go to 15 reps. We're going to increase the weight. I mean, and this is, you'd be amazed. Some programs, you'll see some college programs where this is all they do. The lifts don't change. There's no progression. There's nothing in there except change the reps, change the reps, change the reps. And then they wonder why people fail to adapt. But you could go to 3 sets of 5, go to a volume of 15, right? You drop the volume by a little less than 50%, 40, 45, whatever it is. And then, you know, we could go back to more volume. Okay, 3 sets of 8 alternating. That's going to make, you know, you're going to add an isometric component in there. You're going to make the set longer. That works. But how well does it work? But the basic idea is that everything, in a lot of ways, is going to be periodized. Because that, you know, we always talk about speed's going to be periodized. Steve talked about, you know, we did this presentation the other day, from, you know, non-competitive speed to short competitive speed to long competitive speed. Conditioning is going to be periodized from starting with easy tempo stuff and building up volume in the reverse direction. All this stuff's going to be periodized, just probably not in the conventional sense. And with most people, I really believe most of the stuff that you read, they don't look at the idea of periodizing speed. They don't look at the idea of periodizing conditioning. They don't look at how to all, literally, like we've got this jigsaw puzzle where we're trying to stick all of these pieces together. Instead, we've got like this big strength piece in the middle, and people are like, well, you know, I can just kind of have little tack-ons on the outside that really aren't going to make any difference. So, given that, you've got an overview, you understand, okay, we've got an off-season, we've got a preseason, we've got an in-season, we've got to periodize it, we've got to phase it, okay. But now what do we periodize? What do we phase? So now you've got to look at what's the recipe. Obviously, you guys, the recipe is repetitive, but step 1, roll. And one of the things that we talked about, and you guys were in that other talk in Merrimack, we're going to roll mostly the back and a little bit on the front. We're going to roll the stuff that tends to be held long for longer periods of time. We go back to that gamer guy sitting in his chair, crouched over, and realize that those muscles that are long on a very consistent basis are the muscles that we need to roll. That's not that complicated. And so if you look at this stuff, it's not tough to say, okay, the process is easy, but the process has to be done. Just because it's easy doesn't mean you can skip it and or not do it. I would look at this, and this is the one thing that I have to keep saying over and over and over again. If your athletes aren't rolling, you're out of your mind. This might be the simplest, most effective intervention that we can conceivably make. And the basic idea, work your way up. Start at your butt, mid-back, up into your thoracic spine. I mean, it's really not a complicated process, but it's amazing how people will make it complicated. And then here we're just looking at being up in that T-spine area. So you're thinking, roll that back side of you out, starting with your glutes. And again, the more time you got, the more stuff you're going to roll. If someone said, I got a lot of time, 4-day a week, okay, we'll start at hamstrings. Someone says, hey, we got a lot of time. Okay, I'm going to start at calves, but I'm going to keep going up that backside from bottom to top as I go. You know, address that posterior, like lat, posterior shoulder, posterior cuff stuff, because again, those are going to be things that are going to be in that long category. And then this is where you get into the exceptions, right? I still think you should be rolling your adductors. Because again, if you think about things that are going to be short, your adductors are going to be short. People aren't going to move in the frontal plane very well. People, even though you might look at that and say, well, it's not really a front side muscle. It's not really a backside muscle. It's sort of a medial side muscle. But again, that to me, that's an area that is a big tension holder. Most people, when you start showing them how to roll their adductors, they are cringing, thinking, oh my God, I've never even thought about these muscles before. The other thing you think about is when you start talking about what gets pulled, groins get pulled. And groins is groin is a garbage term for adductors and hip flexors. So adductors are easy to get at. And then I do think you should address your quads. Again, it's easy, it's fast. Again, I would not look at this in terms of being one of the short muscles, but relatively easy to do. When you think about most everything else in the front side, there isn't a lot of mass on the front side. You can't roll your abs. It's hard to roll your anterior tibialis. It's not easy to roll your pecs. It's not easy to roll your serratus anterior. So the other thing about that, when we talk about logistics, is most of the backside stuff is pretty easy to get at. So it ends up working doubly well. After that, you stretch. The big thing to understand with stretching, hip rotators, hip flexors, hamstrings, adductors. I think, again, when you look at stretching, one of the things I think people do wrong is they tend to stretch the same muscles over and over again, as opposed to looking at this and realizing, like, in my mind, we have 4 major areas that will tend to be tight, and they are hip rotators will tend to be tight, hip flexors will tend to be tight, hamstrings, particularly lateral hamstrings, will tend to be tight, adductors will tend to be tight. What's the logical thing to do? Stretch what's tight. What's the illogical thing to do? Spend a really long time stretching your hamstrings and nothing else. And in fact, although there's no proof to this, people who get really flexible in one muscle group, I have friends in athletic training who really feel like people who get really flexible in one muscle group will tend to injure that muscle group more frequently. And it really makes sense when you think about if you develop a significant degree of freedom in one plane of motion of a joint, but have limitations in the others, you're probably going to have issues with that joint. So we've got to think, particularly here, because we're looking at hip joint, we want that hip joint to be able to move, you know, in extension, in flexion, in abduction, and in rotation. And that's really what we're doing. So if we're looking at hamstrings, are going to be moving that muscle in flexion. Hip flexors are going to be moving that joint in extension. Abduction is going to be move that, or, you know, adductors, we're going to be moving that muscle into abduction, and then hip rotators, we're going to be actually rotating that joint. So now we're thinking really stretching is hip mobility, because that's what all that is. It's all hip mobility stuff. So if you look at that and people say, you know, you're doing hip mobility work? Yep, lots of it. Maybe not thinking about it specifically in that way, but we are absolutely trying to free up that joint so that it has 360-degree movement capability. How do we do that? Obviously, here, I just filmed this like 2 minutes ago because I realized I don't have that, the flex cushion, which I just love the flex cushion idea. But pigeon in yoga, whatever it is, the flex cushion makes this stretch way better. But the basic idea, hip rotator stretch. If we look at here, this would be more hip flexor.
And then they're going to have to stand themselves back up to here and be able to get into this position. Again, you don't want huge arch. And what tends to work, most of them are going to have trouble. It'll be interesting to watch you guys. Most of our athletes will be very much laterally flexed on the side they're trying to stretch. I think they're really tight through their TFL. So we try to get guys to think about hip checking out away from there. The other thing we try to get them doing, if they're better, is to be able to grab opposite hand to their heel behind and pull their heel more in line with their body so that it's not way out to the side, and get them through here. This again, you know, because what you do now is you're getting that 2-joint function of the rectus femoris, so you're stretching it as both a quad and as a hip flexor.
So we would look at that as like a quad hip flexor stretch. the one difference we would make, and this is, believe it, that's Functional Strength Coach 1. I don't even know what year that is, but I happen to have that one I have a lot of archived video. The biggest difference there, we'd be encouraging people to breathe, which we weren't at that time. We weren't worried about that, and we had lots of people stretching, like literally like eyes closed, teeth crunched. And that's where you start looking at the breathing part, like trying to get somebody to think, okay, relax, breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth. Take a big deep breath, exhale, and then trying to line people up. And I talked about this in the staff meeting the other day, but when I had Brendan Lean the other day going through this stuff with him, he was one of those guys who got, a lot of people will get really good at almost getting in the right position and avoiding where they're really tight. And that's why we talk about that idea of thinking hip check to that side and trying to get long through that side, because you'll look at a lot of people and you'll kind of see this. They'll basically slump right into their tightness, and it's a very natural thing to do. You've got to develop, when you start thinking about your eyes, the art of coaching part, that ability to look and think, oops, he's doing exactly what I don't want him to do. He's fake stretching. And that's, Sarman refers to it as relative compensatory flexibility, where you figure out a way to move. The biggest illustration of relative compensatory flexibility is the sit and reach idea, right? Because if you look at sit and reach versus active straight leg raise, just so you understand the concept, you know what I mean? If I'm here and, you know, I'm like, oh yeah, I can touch my toes easy. That's a really good example of relative compensatory flexibility. I'm not particularly flexible through my hamstrings. If you looked at me, active straight leg raise, I barely get to 90. But I can create a lot of motion through my lumbar spine. So it's literally relative compensatory flexibility. I can make something look like something else. And people get really good at that, fake stretching. So when you're out there with people, you've got to realize, nope, that's not what, I don't want fake stretching, I want real stretching. And they should, if they don't have a little bit of that, if they don't look a little uncomfortable, real good chance they're not doing it right. Same thing here when you talk about lateral hamstring. And these, I didn't realize these all have audio, so.
Working on being in position, internal rotation here. And I'm just thinking, you know, whether I want to deliver a little bit of rotation. 15 seconds down. 30 seconds is long. Halfway. So halfway, switch.
This was the old workout muse. But the one thing you can see is if you look at pelvis, right? This is what I've got to be looking at, is where's my pelvis, and I'm looking, that's why I said neutral or internally rotated, neutral or internally rotated, because if we look at that relative compensatory flexibility thing, if we have someone who's going to try to do this, the easiest thing to do is to stand up here. If I let this foot turn out, that's relative compensatory flexibility. I've already said, okay, I realize that I'm tight in my external rotators, so I'm going to sit in external rotation. The person who's tight will sit in double external rotation. They'll have this foot externally rotated, they'll have this foot externally rotated, and then they'll slump like this. And that's almost like, okay, I've almost slacked up all the stuff I'm supposed to stretch, so I kind of look like I did what you wanted me to do, but I didn't do any of the things that you wanted me to do. And if you say to that person, okay, now bring this bottom foot to neutral, bring this foot to neutral, usually as soon as you do that, they're going to go like, whoa, that's really different. And then if you say to them, okay, now try to bring your pelvis around, their face is going to change really, really drastically. Most of the time I will take that person, I'll put my hand on this hip, and I'll pull it around for them so they really feel. Because again, if you start thinking, we talk about this functional anatomy stuff, everything's going here. That's not that complicated to think, okay, how's that lateral aspect put together? You know, bicep femoris, glute max, all this, you know, glute med, glute min, all this stuff that's underneath into your IT band. It's like, you know, if I go this way, all I got to do, if I just simply open that pelvis up, I slacked it all. If I come around this way, and that's where you'll watch, that's, you know, the people who can't SLDL, you'll see the same thing. And some of them may never, like you may have some soccer and hockey players who will never get in that position well because they live in external rotation, right? Hockey players live in external rotation. Soccer players live in external rotation. But you still want to try to alter their hip mobility and get them out of that external rotation. Because the one thing I always like to tell everybody, 1 degree changes everything. 1 degree is the difference between labral tear and surgery and no labral tear and no surgery. And the analogy that I always use, if you look at that door closes by basically less than a quarter inch on either side, but it closes perfect. And I have a couple slides, but I should probably put them back in. I should look and see if they're in that original Functional Strength Coach 6, but we show one of those doors where the screws are loose at the top and the door hangs up. You try to close the door and you always have to lift the handle up to get it closed. And if you just go in and put 2 turns in that top hinge, suddenly your joints are going to work that way in terms of your shoulder joint, your hip joint particularly, even your lumbar spine to some degree. There's painful and not painful, and painful and not painful can literally be the difference. Like if we look at, Brandon, the difference of the thickness of that piece of paper. If that piece of paper can pass through that space and I no longer have bones touching each other, that person will be pain-free. If I lose the thickness of that piece of paper and I now have bones touching each other, that person will have pain. So you don't have to create, this is why sometimes people say, well, we stretch all the time, we don't get more flexible. You don't need to be a lot more flexible, you just need to be a little bit more flexible. You may just need to be like literally the width of the piece of paper more flexible for that to make a difference. In here, this is actually even old. This is 04 video, which is crazy. But just the stationary Spider-Man. This is one when you think about bang for your buck, not having a lot of time, force couples, hip separation. This is a pretty good stretch because I've got obviously hip extension on my back leg and I've got hip flexion on my front leg. So I'm ending up getting really exactly what I wanted to get. That's why, Mark, if you look at in the old Athletes Performance, Core Performance stuff, Mark calls this the world's greatest stretch because when you look at it's the world's greatest stretch because you get a huge amount of bang for your buck. The one thing I realized is I watched, this is how we used to stretch hip rotators, and watch what they do. And this is actually a really good idea. We just don't have enough walls, so we got away from doing it. So what we would do is we'd make them start with their butt off the ground, and then we'd literally use their body weight to drive them into the stretch. And I'd actually forgotten we did it until I started looking at this clip. I was like, oh, that was a really good idea. But because a lot of times we don't have enough wall space, we tend to get away from things. That's why even when we do like the roller stretching, a lot of the roller stretching was born out of the idea that, okay, we don't have the tables, we don't have the stuff that we need to have to get what we would consider to be the best stretches that we can do done, so we've got to come up with some alternatives. Even here, we don't do this. If you look, there's some of these, like I said, this wall quad or wall rectus or wall hip flex, whatever you want to look at. And I think if we had more wall and more time, but our biggest wall area we were always using to throw against. So we don't end up having as much. Same thing here, adductors. This is another, in my mind, really high bang for the buck because I can get my floor slide integrated with my sort of passive adductor stretch. When I'm in that situation, I've got this really big passive adductor load because the weight of my legs is producing the stretch for me. And now I can make this, like with Mike, we're making this into a breathing drill and saying, hey, I want that floor slide, so now I'm getting my internal rotator stretched while I'm doing it. I'm incorporating my breathing. So again, this would be another thing that I would say would fall in that really high bang for the buck category when you got walls available. I'll do this almost every day with the baseball guys because I can always get at a wall, and a lot of times I'll do that wall quad one. But sometimes here, from a business standpoint, we won't do these things because you got a group of 12. You don't have enough room to get 12 kids with feet spread like that. So it doesn't always work the way that we want it to logistically. But the idea, roll, we talk because thinking the idea is designing a strength training program, roll, stretch, and then this warm-up mobility activation thing, which we would just call warm-up, but I think depending on who the person is and who you're talking to, they might look at it differently, and they might say, oh, those are activation exercises, okay? Those are mobility exercises, okay? Whatever, they're warm-up exercises. I always think it's warm-up. Don't worry about it. It's an extension of warm-up because when we really look at it, we've been doing corrective exercise. Rolling is corrective exercise because if you look at some of the FMS correctives, one of the first things they're going to tell you, foam roll blank. Okay, it's corrective. They might then tell you, okay, stretch blank, because that's corrective. The point here is we've got this sort of corrective cascade that we're developing that's going to kind of end here. And it's funny, we only got like 35 minutes left, and this was interesting because I wasn't sure if this would even go 2 hours, and now I realize I will probably have to step it up to get through 2 hours, but that's okay. And I said this could be a talk by itself, but the one thing I would say with people, warm up, mobility, activation, if you just think FMS and you think about your FMS patterns and you think about squat, lunge, step, rotary stability, linear stability, shoulder mobility, you'll probably put together a pretty good warm up. And that's kind of what we've done. That's why a lot of this stuff is kind of sprinkled in where it's sprinkled in. This was, I don't know how long this is, so we'll have to see. But this was one that we did in the staff meeting. I'm just going to let it run because I'm pretty sure the audio is there. Oh my goodness, this was almost a year ago.
Now line up, think like 6 across, because I want you to think about what this would look like, because I think this is sometimes what happens is the kids flop. So yeah, like really think, I'm trying to organize a group of these kids that are all over the map. And the more organized you can make them, so we've got to say, Nick, move away from Steve, right? Okay, move away from Steve, no touching Steve, Nick, no touching Steve, move back up. But see, that's the shit you got to do though, because with the kids, yeah, even with the adults to some degree, and then say, okay, put the band on your feet, everybody's going to stand up. And already we haven't given ourselves quite enough space because, you know what we're going to do? Because we're smart, we're all going to turn 90 degrees to our right. Perfect. And then we're going to think 10 steps to your right, the other right. Yeah. Oh, I turned 90 mine up. See, everybody did what I did. Good. And then just think 10 steps, keeping your feet wide, not letting the band slack. And if this is done right, they should stay about the same distance away from each other. So Steve can't touch Nick, Nick can't touch Steve, and then we're going to go back 10 steps to our left. Right? Exactly. Burn. Now you're going to turn back around and face me.
And so, we can look at that stuff, and obviously that's logistics. When you think about warm-up. I hate when people let the kids get in a circle and warm up. But I realize it's been a year since we've said I hate when people let the kids. I would have, I didn't look at that date when I put this clip in. I can't believe that was 11 months ago. But it was 11 months ago. But when you think, so what is that? Mini bands, it's warm-up, right? It is warm-up. It's hip mobility work. It's hip activation work. So we could put it into a whole bunch of categories in terms of, you'd say, well, it's not really hip mobility because you're not moving that far. But it is hip mobility because it's active hip mobility. I'm teaching somebody how to use their abductors. Because what I have when I mini band walk that you don't think about is I basically have open chain abduction on the side I'm moving towards, closed chain abduction on the side I'm moving away from, because it's literally like a push and a step, a push and a step. I go back the other way, and it's now closed chain abduction here. That's why you get that crazy burn in your glutes, because you're using both at the same time. You're just using them in slightly different functions. That's a good thing for the hip. When we think about hip mobility, that ability to stabilize, we're turning on that muscle whose job is primarily to stabilize. They're not big movers. That stuff doesn't happen a whole lot. But we're getting those things. And I always like to use it. It's too bad we don't have dimmers in here, but I love the idea of dimmer switches. Because that's what I think about when I think of activation exercises. Is it like being in a room with a dimmer switch and having to dial the dimmer up? Okay. It's on, but now it's really on. When I get that on, and you'll see with this, if you have someone who struggles with one leg straight leg deadlift, or someone who's struggling with one leg squat, and sometimes you mix it in with some mini bands and you kind of get a little more on in those hip stabilizers, suddenly that gets better.
Lying back. And this is where, again, specific instructions. Pull both knees to your chest. Hold your right knee. Extend your left leg for 5 seconds, and you're going to exhale. 5. Then you're going to pull both knees in and hold them. You're going to hold your left leg, extend your right, and exhale for 5. And when you're teaching, you're not going to be able to do that. We're going to do that 2 more times. Pull them both in, hold your right, extend your left, and realize that you've got to explain all of this or they will screw it up. And telling them to have their head back on the ground so their neck doesn't cramp up. Switch sides. Hold that knee up and then release it.
come we don't do this one?
Big exhale so they feel their stomach contract.
I was just thinking
one
the
more
same
on each
thing.
side.
I don't know. It's really funny how, you know, I think sometimes things just sort of come and go, and I don't really know if I can tell you that I know why all the time. This was one I was trying to think. I actually did this warm-up for the Shamrock Girls because I was trying to come up with a simple FMS-based warm-up that we could do in place without having people going all over the place. But when you look at here, what do you have? That's hurdle step, right? It's hip flexion. You're trying to get them to be able to recruit their deep hip flexors, and you're doing that by pulling their knees up above their chest and then asking them to hold. So it would be very similar to doing just standing iso holds. But when you say, why aren't we doing it? Sometimes, and there'll be probably other things here that we're not doing either.
And
Let's
then
say,
opposite.
I don't know how long this clip is.
And then they're going to sit up, take the band off. Now they're going to go hook hip lift. And again, if we said, hey, we really want to take a lot of time to set it up, we can give everybody a ball. I would not give everybody a ball because what will the kids do? Throw the balls at each other, right? Steve and Nick will be throwing the ball at each other. Or he'll just be rolling it so it hits him in the back or whatever it is, and then we'll have to talk to him, right? But think, left foot, toe up, exactly, bunks gutted, pull that left knee into your chest, same thing, head back, drive up with your left glute, exhale for 5. Here we're going to stay on the same side, butt back down, take a breath in.
So here you could look and say glute activation, psoas stretching, rotary stability. And it would be like, yes, 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 check, 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 right? So, and that's where you realize some of these simple, you know, I'm getting my glutes turned on. In the process of getting my glute turned on, I'm stretching the hip flexors on that side. If I get to the hands-free quick hip lift, I'm now adding a hurdle step component to that by being able to hold that top leg up. So what I want you to understand with the warm-up stuff is that there's a lot going on all at the same time, and that it's all really purposeful, even though sometimes it doesn't look it. Sometimes it just looks like, oh, do this, do this, do this, and we don't think through why, and that's the beginning of this talk that we didn't do, but you guys heard up at Merrimack, is sort of that start with why idea, like why are we doing the things that we're doing? So,
So with this one, with the stretch before that with the band, it seems like now with how we do it and press against the knee, it seems like we added the two together.
yes, and that's exactly what we did. And that's sort of because one of the things that we've run into is just the kind of logistics of how do we get this done fast enough to get out in the weight room where we got to go. But that's exactly what, I'm sorry. Sorry.
Now
Little
line up, think
mistake.
like 6 o'clock. Left leg. And then right leg. And what I've been telling the kids is think like you're going to blow your leg. You're trying to blow your leg down. So be really active, pushing air out, looking at them and seeing, am I getting in through the nose, out through the mouth? Because if you are, I mean, this actually...
Oh, crap. I keep thinking I'm stopping that, and I'm not. I apologize. I don't know why that is switching instead of stopping, but... So, and when you look, it's the same thing. You know, when you look at that leg lower, what are you looking at? You're looking at active straight leg raise, right? And you're looking again at hip separation, and you're looking again at core control, and you realize we always talk about the fact that this is, I think leg lowering is one of the more complicated things that we do. Yet you would probably look at it and realize that, wow,
left leg. And then right leg. And what I've been telling the kids is
I'll just let this
you're
run.
gonna blow your leg. You're trying to blow your leg down. So be really active, pushing air out, looking at them and seeing, am I getting in through the nose, out through the mouth? Because if you are, I mean, this actually, the leg lower without the band ends up being a pretty good core exercise. But they're already here, right? Feet flat, hands up over their head, same idea. Inhale through their nose, big mouth, exhale, 5 seconds overhead. Inhale again through their nose, exhale. Same thing, inhale. And you can kind of see like 3 sets of 5-second breath tends to work timing-wise about right. Then you think, okay, if I go from there, all right, now I can flip over. So now I'm in quadruped, get up on all fours. And now just think, all I want to do is look at the floor and look at the ceiling 10 times. And then I want to look to my right, and I want to look to my left 10 times. And then I want to think about that quadruped opposite action. Same thing, 3 5-second breaths. And now I'm cueing them. I'm thinking toes up to my shin, driving my heel out. If I've got people that can't get arm and leg, just leg. But I would ideally 5, and I'm going to do 3 on each side. And then I'm going to switch sides.
And again, I would look at that and say, another really complicated exercise. Because this is an exercise where people are going to really naturally cheat. They're going to naturally lumbar extend. They're going to try to move. We talk about that relative compensatory flexibility. This would be relative compensatory movement. I'm going to move my lumbar spine. I'm going to move my pelvis because I can't get my glute to work. And this is where Brett Jones had a really good cue. If you think 2 things, drive your heel out with your toe up and don't let your heel go above your butt, you'll do it right. If you look like Tia, kind of old aerobics class, big lumbar extension component. I always look at that. That's going to make your back worse. The right way is going to make your back better. But it's all of the nitpicky little stuff that's in this warm-up where we're looking, and again, where are we? Rotary stability, right? Quadruped. So the idea is just that we're working through this kind of developmental sequence that the FMS has already kind of outlined for us.
Up and make them think. 1,
Squat pattern, toe touch
2,
squat.
3, 4, 5, so they don't
And this, actually,
dump
that's,
their way through them. And then if you're thinking, now you're back to lunge, split squat step, but you've been able to do it. If we're pressed for space, it works out really well. If we're trying to control a bunch of young kids, it works out really well. And the cool thing, and that's, like I said, from Kazi's standpoint, is
so the important thing just to understand is that you've got to organize the warm-up. You've got to realize that the warm-up has to be purposeful. It's not, we could just say, hey, run in place. That'd be warm-up, right? Mat runs, that'd be warm-up. But it wouldn't address the specific things that we know that we need to address in terms of patterning. And I always like to think, this then lays the groundwork for them to go into the weight room and hopefully be able to goblet squat, be able to split squat, be able to do 1 leg straight leg deadlift. If we're getting better here, we should be better over there. That's the logic behind the whole thing. That's why it's set up the way that it is. And then we go back to this power idea, and I'm going to have to, because I only got 20 minutes. But the basic idea, I always talk about power times 3, because when we look at this, med balls, jumps, and then resisted, when the most important thing we do, particularly, even I guess with everybody, really is power training. If you look at the amount of times that we're addressing that. In an athlete program, we address power at least 3 times. In an adult program, we address power at least twice. And so you realize that's more than anything else that we're doing. When we're looking at med balls, we're looking at jumps, we're looking at some sort of resisted power component. But we're back to that risk-benefit ratio thing again and saying, okay, who do I have? How much risk do I want to take? Because if we're looking at rotational med ball throwing, power, rotary power. And really, rotary power, sequential joint action, learning to create motion from the ground through your torso up through your hands. Right? Really overhead power, power in flexion. But you could look at it. Lat power, as much as I probably don't want to look at it that way, but, and then pushing power. And this is where sometimes I don't, when people talk about, I like triphasic training and they talk about all this stuff, I think they underestimate what we're doing and they don't really look at what we're doing and realize like there's way more thought process going on here in terms of we're progressing power in all of these different areas and we're progressing it through difficulty, through posture. Like again, with our med ball throwing sequence, there's a progression that's built into the med ball throwing sequence. When you look at jumping, there's a progression that's built into the jumping sequence. All this stuff has actually been periodized per se and put into progressions and thoughts and all this stuff, and people tend to basically miss it because they don't pay enough attention. And then just jumping. And really, when you think about our plyometric work, jumping, hopping, bounding, because we're not simply saying, okay, yes, this is power. This is sort of very similar to Olympic lifting. It's very straight, very linear, very bilaterally hip-oriented. But that's one day for us. Then you're going to look at the next day is going to be unilateral orientation. The next day is going to be frontal plane orientation. There's always going to be something that's going on that's got more thought process to it than strictly thinking, yes, we want neural, but we want neural, and then we want muscular specificity at the same time. We want positional specificity. We want carryover to sport. There's all this other stuff that's going on. And then we want to build that stuff again into progressions for somebody so that we're not giving them too much difficulty as they come out of the gate. But then you get back to power. It's still power, right? If you got kids cleaning, you got kids Olympic lifting, and this is, I wouldn't say it's a different type of power, but I guess it is when you really look at it, and that's why I would look at things and say basically you've got light implement power, medicine balls, you've got body weight power, and you've got heavy implement power, and they all matter. There isn't one, you can't say, yeah, we got to do one, not the other, but you get into that risk-benefit idea. The risk becomes greater here. But I look at, as I said, this kid, Charlie's trying to play in the NHL. Charlie's now playing in the NHL, right? I'm going to be willing to take some risk with Charlie. I might have, if you came in and saw our 30-plus-year-old NHL guys, they're probably not hang cleaning 280 for singles. They're not going to be in that situation because now you've got a guy who's a veteran who's making money. If that guy gets hurt and misses time, misses a season, maybe he doesn't make the team. And there's just that difference where you're always balancing that scale. And then you've got, you're adults, and actually this is one of our, and Johnny's not, I would say older now, I guess, in the sense that he's 29 years old, but doesn't tolerate, has had some wrist issues, doesn't tolerate cleaning like he used to, and now all of a sudden he's doing double kettlebell swings. When you look at our adult clients, they're doing single kettlebell swings because we still want to get power. We still want that neuromuscular effect of rapid hip extension, but we've got to be balancing that risk-benefit scale. Versus, as I said, the CrossFit idea of just, taking some guy, someone who walks in here at 40 years old and saying, yeah, we're going to do clean and jerks today. Thrusters, if you want to use the CrossFit vernacular. But, you know what I mean? It's like, whatever, squat to press. I mean, that's not going to sit real well with the average person that comes in. And then you can even look at here. Okay, clean versus snatch. In all honesty, this is Megan Duggan, who's our Olympic captain. I would prefer snatches in a perfect world with better athletes because you get less load, you get greater distance. If you look in risk-benefit, that has less risk-benefit than clean in terms of if we're looking at the risk side. But for the inexperienced kids, I think it has more risk benefit because you start looking at the kids who aren't accomplished lifters and trying to control loads over their head and worrying about bringing the load back down. But for better athletes, snatches are going to be less risky and they're going to be easier to teach, easier to do, easier to learn. But yeah, basic idea, it's still power. You've got to be looking at saying, okay, how do I fill that resisted power piece for this person? How do I balance their scale? And that is going to change from person to person. Even like I said with my daughter, Michaela now, she's really hypermobile. You know, she's one of these kids, she can do splits and Chinese splits. She gets up to 150 pounds in the clean and she starts getting SI joint pain. It's like, risk benefit doesn't work for me anymore. Let's do snatches. You know, and now she's snatching 75, 80 pounds and that's fine. She doesn't have any of the associated joint issues that she was getting from those heavier cleans. So you just realize that even at young ages, sometimes you make those distinctions. And same thing here. So this is Casey that we talked about that hasn't gained any weight. But look at, I mean, that's a 55-pound dumbbell. But still power. And in some ways, I'd look at that and think, that's probably, if I was tiering them, I might say that's the best exercise. Because suddenly now I've got unilateral shoulder support, I've got unilateral core control, like I've got a lot of other things that are going on that might make that the best of the three. I might be able to say dumbbell snatch would be best, bar snatch would be second, hang clean would be third. But when we go back to our beginners, we're back to like our ABC thing. When I've got my 10-year-old Mark in here, I'm teaching him clean. Because we're going to start at the beginning. As he develops the ability to feel the bar, to control the bar, maybe then we do start teaching him to snatch. As he develops the ability to hold things over his head, we will teach him dumbbell snatch. And then, and we're in the last 15 minutes, which I can't believe how fast this goes. Strength, push, pull, knee dominant, hip dominant, core. So when you start thinking about putting the program together, now we've looked at the program. We've got to roll, we've got to stretch, we've got to warm up, we've got to do our power work. And then now we're finally in the weight room. So for us, if you're thinking, and you guys have been here, those of you that are watching, sitting here right now, that aren't sort of watching it on tape, that have been here, realize it takes us 30 to 40 minutes to get through that process and to get to here. And then we're going to have another 30 to 45 minutes of strength work. And then we've got to look at all of that stuff. So if we go back to here and we say, okay, push, pull, knee dominant, hip dominant, core, and then that's all going to be broken down into regression and progression. And this was one of the things that I added from the talk with the mentorship people. Regression is in phase, progression is next phase. That's something that I know in my head that I would not have thought to say until somebody asked me that. You would not progress somebody within the phase. You would stay, if we said we're doing eccentric split squats, we're doing eccentric split squats. And even if someone was good at eccentric split squat, you wouldn't change that during that phase. But if we were doing eccentric split squats or eccentric rear foot elevated split squats and they couldn't do it, you would immediately regress them. So we've got to think about, the regressions are very reactive. I'm reacting to what I see, and generally I'm reacting to something that I don't like, and I'm moving them back to something that I'm going to like. Versus progression is what's going to happen next, what's going on the next 3 weeks. So that's a really important distinction to make that I think, and Kev, that's something I know you're taking that picture because I realize it's not in the material that we have now, because I feel like it's one of those things that all of us that are teaching already know it, but the people that are watching don't, and people get confused. So we're hopefully going to unconfuse people. When we think about designing regressions and progressions, we're thinking about developmental sequence. Half kneel, lunge, stand, single leg. The idea of getting them from the ground. We don't tend to, if you look at like Greg Rose's 4x4 matrix idea, we will not tend to start a lot of stuff in supine or a lot of stuff in quadruped. We will tend to be in that, I guess, that half kneel position is the third stage of the developmental sequence, and that will be sort of, in general, if we've got healthy people, that's as low as we're going to go. But we deliberately start, and this is a great Cook thing, you start in half kneel because you eliminate joints. And it was really funny when initially, I've been really lucky in the sense that I get to talk to guys like Gray all the time and be able to say, okay, why half kneel? Why half kneel chops? Why half kneel lift? And one of the things, or why tall kneel? And one of the things that he said is that if you want to control something, eliminate joints. If you want to control their hips, eliminate their knees and their ankles. put them in half kneel, put them in tall kneel. And it was one of those very quick common sense things where you go, oh, that makes perfect sense. I would not have thought of that. I would have probably spent time trying to coach them out of moving other joints as opposed to simply saying, okay, let's just get those joints out of the picture. And that's why when you start thinking about even crawling patterns and supine stuff, when I had Daniel, when we were doing the hip stuff, I had to go back and start thinking about supine stuff that I wouldn't normally do because suddenly I have someone who's still painful in standing. It's like, okay, let's see what supine looks like. Let's see what quadruped looks like. Let's go back to crawling. Let's go back to baby crawling. Let's go back to some stuff that maybe we wouldn't normally do. You may see that stuff pop up in warm-up, but you generally won't see it pop up in lifting. When you think about loading, and I added this last night, use what you have and use what makes sense. Because one, use what you have. It's amazing how people will ask questions about, well, I don't have kettlebells. Well, then obviously you can't use them. Okay, that would be a really rapid answer. Like if there's no kettlebells, definitely don't use them. But people will still ask that question. So you use what you have and you use what makes sense. What makes sense? And the reason I said use what makes sense, I don't think this stuff makes sense. I don't think spinal front and back makes sense. I don't want, spinal loading to me is going to be the last thing that I'm going to consider. Front squat loading, back squat loading, they're going to be the last things that I'm going to consider. Not that I won't consider them, just that they're going to be the last thing that I'm going to consider. Because there's going to be a lot of other stuff. Use what makes sense. Assisted may make more sense. If someone's weak, what do I need? I need assistance, right? I need to make it less than their body weight. If somebody's just able to handle their body weight, what do I need to use? Well, I need to use their body weight. You know what I mean? If someone's needs more core stimulation, then I might think about goblet position or rack position or Zercher position, something, you know, like Zercher. I'm not a Zercher fan. I think we talked about that. And Zercher is basically in the crook of your elbows. So, you know, like sometimes we'll do sandbag carries that way. I think, like, I hate the idea of Zercher squatting. Some people will Zercher squat. They'll pad the bar up and they'll actually squat. And Joe's like, but they will. I think that's really stupid. But I think if you have someone who squats poorly, Zercher squats are going to be good for them because it's, again, creating that kind of stiffness that the goblet loading position creates. So you've got to keep thinking, what makes sense for this person at this time? I would think if I want Joe to squat, Zercher doesn't make any sense. You know, if he says, well, I can squat 405 for 5, I'm not going to look at him and think, let's see if we can Zercher that. You know, see how your elbows feel, right? Because we all laugh. That doesn't make any sense. But if I have an adult client who's maybe said, oh, you know, my wrists hurt, and I think, but geez, I'd love for them to goblet squat, or maybe I'll just give them the sandbag in that Zercher position because they don't have to hold on with their hands. That makes sense. So we want to be thinking about these loading parameters as what makes the most sense. Kettlebells make sense for one leg straight leg deadlift. They make more sense than dumbbells. They're more comfortable. Kettlebells are better for carries. I can carry the 36 kilo kettlebells. I don't like carrying 62-pound dumbbells or 72-pound dumbbells. I struggle. You know, the wobble this way of the dumbbell is not nearly as comfortable for me. The straight down effect of the kettlebell makes those carries much easier. I can carry closer to my body weight with kettlebells than I can with dumbbells. That makes sense. Okay, so that's the stuff that we've got to look at when we're thinking about this process. And then same thing, implements, keep it simple. Body weight, kettlebell, dumbbell, barbell, vest, pulleys. What do you got? Simple, simple, simple. If you look, we were talking, Kevin Carr and I were talking the other day about this, and it's amazing when you look at how big our gym is and how little equipment we have. If you looked around and said, okay, make a list of all the stuff that you have, you'd be like, well, there's racks and there's bars and there's adjustable benches and there's dumbbells and there's kettlebells and there's the Kaiser machines. And you're like, that's pretty much all we have. There's some little odds and ends stuff, you know, MVP shuttles or sleds or whatever, but the reality is there's not much for the amount of stuff that's here. There's not a broad variety of stuff. There's simply lots of the same stuff. There's a lot of dumbbells. There's a lot of bars. There's a lot of adjustable benches. And so that's the idea when you think about keeping it simple. And then think from there, then you build programs. Baseline, regression, regression, regression. Baseline, progression, progression, progression. And I did put it in here. So baseline is phase 1, progression 1 is phase 2, progression 2 is phase 3, progression 3 is phase 4. Right? That's okay. That's easy to do. It's the regression stuff that's harder because you might change the baseline to regression 1 and then have to work your way back up that way. And then what you realize is that thoughts lead to programs. Because back here, if I look at this, okay, I've got thoughts about what I want to do. But eventually those thoughts become programs, and I'll give you a really good example. We were talking about this idea of not doing eccentric in the first phase, but we do eccentric in the first phase. But the reason that we'll do eccentric in the first phase is it's not because we're worried about we want it to produce more soreness. It's not because we want more time under tension. It's because we realize we get the control of the movement that we need by making that exercise in eccentric. So suddenly, even though if I'm looking and that's gone, but if I'm looking back there at my phase one and saying, I don't want phase one to be traumatic, I don't want it to be big soreness producer, I still may do something that will produce big soreness because it's going to get the control. And that's where I go back to the idea of like thoughts create programs. We look at it and think, well, what's our problem? Well, our problem is that everybody's split squatting and they're just falling down like this and they're just dropping down and they're losing their posture. And then we think, well, what if we did eccentric emphasis? What if we said 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then back up? We're going to be okay. So literally the thought creates the program, us looking at it and going, all right, we need to fix this. How do we fix this? Well, we fix this by making it eccentric. When we looked at, same thing with, doing eccentric bench. Why are we doing eccentric bench? Same reason. Because no matter how much we tell the kids not to drop the bar on themselves, when they want to lift more weight, they stop dropping the bar. So we suddenly say, okay, let's think 3-second lowers, count for them, 3, 2, 1. We put something in deliberately to make happen what we want to have happen. And that's why I said, so baseline, but I've switched, like if you think about baseline, I think, and this goes back from a thought process standpoint, I think baseline should be back to split squat. And we've talked about this in staff meetings. I don't know if we've talked about it in staff meetings since you guys were here, but I think we go to rear foot elevated too fast with our beginners, and they need to master that goblet movement better, and they need to get stronger. Because I've noticed, and I probably will try to get some clips of the girls in Michaela's team doing it, because that's who I did it with. And there's a bunch of them that are goblet split squatting 60s and 70s girls, and you're like, it looks pretty good. So I think it does in fact work in that situation. But same idea, regression, progression, regression. You've always got to have that idea of progression, regression. Where do I go? Most importantly, regression. Where do I go backwards if what I'm doing isn't working? Progression is probably built in for you in terms of it's going to be in the program and it's going to be easy. Regression, you're going to have to be thinking on your feet and reacting to this and saying, hey, I need to do blank. So obviously, I would call this now, I have this in there as regression 1, but the reality is it might be baseline. And then if we look at regression 2, assisted, make them lighter. When someone says, I can't do it, think, well, what could, and I kind of use the same jokes all the time, but I've told lots of people that the biggest thing they got wrong with them is a bad case of weakness. Because you'll have people say, oh, my knee really hurts. And then if you deload them, they say, oh, my knee doesn't hurt anymore. You know what that tells you? There's nothing wrong with your knee. Because if we go through the same range of motion and the pain goes away with less load, problem's the load, not the joint. That's, again, we go back to the common sense not being a very common idea, but that's common sense. When someone said, my shoulder doesn't hurt until I go over 200 on the bench, well, that might have something to do with 200 as opposed to your shoulder. Because if your shoulder's fine, if it's doing this and it's doing this and it doesn't hurt, and then we add a certain amount of load to it, the load is the problem, not the joint. We shouldn't be fixing the joint. We should be fixing the load. And again, progression 1 is just to take the eccentric out in some cases. And then just briefly, and I'm going to go 5 minutes over. I hope you guys don't care. But from a physics standpoint, flexion moments versus extension compression forces. This is why I don't like spinal loading. So when we go to here, right? If we think about what's going on in his spine, he's experiencing a flexion moment. Basically meaning those weights are pulling him into flexion and he needs to pull himself into extension. If I put a bar behind his back, he'd be experiencing an extension and a compression load. And that's different. And that's why you may see so many people who this doesn't bother them, and then you give them a bar and they're like, that still bothers my back. And it's really about what, when you think about what the spine is experiencing during that process, obviously that's going to change things. You know, think about what's progression. This progression, load. Molly got to the point where this is Molly Shells, who was one of our two-time Olympian as a goalie. She just couldn't hold the kettlebells anymore. Put a weight vest on. Don't go with a heavier kettlebell. Throw the vest on. And so that's the progression, right? Eventually here, what did we progress here? Range of motion. We realized we weren't getting the range of motion that we wanted, so we progressed range of motion. You already saw that. Now this is the last part, and this is what I want you to think about. Progression 5 for me right now is probably just abandoning it altogether and realize that, all right, now we're too far down our own rabbit hole. And I think this is what I thought of when I saw some of the kids this summer, some of the guys who had the 120 dumbbells and the weight vests on, and were really battling to get the dumbbells off the ground and to get into position. And you start thinking, should we not just be hammering that one leg squat?
Just thinking about like moments of joint rotational forces and torques and stuff. So obviously if you have a flexion moment, you need to create, your body needs to create
An extension moment, exactly. Counter that.
How come that doesn't create more pain than having the extension force or like the extension movement just because there's not enough?
Well, and it's because of the difference when you think about moments versus forces. And I think that's the big difference, is that, you know, in that moment, it's going to produce an equal and opposite moment to keep you where you need to be. Whereas with compression, now you've just added a load on top that you really can't, there's no way for you to create an equal and opposite load to that in your spine. Do you know what I mean? Like your erectors can't, you know, you can try to buttress that through here with more core.
You can't decompress on
Right, you can't decompress exactly. And I think that's why, same idea with trap bar, I think that's why we tolerate, like more and more kids tolerate trap bar than tolerate squatting. For the exact same reason, is that flexion moment versus compression extension. And we know that extension is, you know, a lot of people's athletes' backs don't tolerate extension well. And when you take, you know, you just need to be that degree out of extension to have it be pain-free. Sorry, I gotta stick one more slide in here. Because in this, I don't know if I showed you guys this or not, but did we show this in the staff meeting? I think we did. But so, you know, when you think this is basically what Devin has done, right? If we look at, why won't this run? And this is what I'm thinking about with the Olympic girls, is that now there's such a battle between what their back leg is doing, balance position, all this stuff, that we may just be better off trying to figure out, okay, can we get them to 100 pounds of external load for 5? And I haven't got that far yet, but I will. Like this next summer, this is where we'll be going with these girls in terms of, okay, will we get some females to 100 for 5? I know they can do 60 for 10. Because if you see, you know, like if you look at this clip here, this is, I mean, if you look at, that's 40 for 10, so that's 10-pound dumbbells, 20-pound vest. And I did this as an experiment during residency, and it was like breaking sticks. I looked at it and thought, shit, everybody could have done 60. But I didn't have time to sort of repeat it again to see. But, so now I'm looking and saying, okay, what, you know, if I take like an Alex Carpenter, what will Alex Carpenter be able to do? I won't be surprised if she does 100 for 5, which 5 years ago I would have thought was an incredible load for a male. But we go back to that how strong is strong idea. All of a sudden, Devin's been like he chucked the bar way up here somewhere, you know, in terms of raising the bar. You like look and go, holy shit, that guy just one leg squatted 200 pounds. And that's like ridiculous. But we go back to, I forget where I was reading it the other day, but they were talking about the 4-minute mile, and Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile. The next year, 16 people ran sub 4. And prior to that, they thought that you physically you couldn't break the 4-minute mile. There was a time I remember when they said that Alexiev, the Russian Olympic lifter, they said if he goes over 600 pounds in the clean and jerk, he'll probably disintegrate. Like the human skeleton is not made to hold that much weight. And then he eventually broke that weight and went significantly above that. because they don't look at how these, bone responds to stress. This guy's bones are responding to the stress, and he's getting stronger. And his bones are getting stronger, and when you thought that from a force standpoint he wouldn't be able to tolerate it, he did. And you see that in high jump. You see it all over the place. So, just quickly with hip dominant, same idea. I don't like hip dominant bilateral stuff anyway. When you're looking at hip dominant unilateral, or I'll take that back. Beginners, I do like hip dominant bilateral stuff. I think everybody should learn this, kettlebell sumo deadlift. I like the idea of getting to here, to this elevated sumo. I don't know if everybody needs to get to 315 in the trap bar. We talked about this yesterday in the staff meeting, and I filmed this clip. I think this, in my mind, and I know we're still debating this, but I think this should be the baseline, is that cone touch. And I think that this, that we showed you in the staff meeting the other day, should be phase 2. With the idea that if you go to 2 plates and 2 plates is better, okay. But I think in general, from a functional standpoint, I do want to connect that right side lat to that left side glute, and I'm going to do that better. And then, but I think, and Kevin Carr brought up a really good point in terms of adults versus kids. This might be a better phase 2 for the adult clients. Because as I said, I was very surprised how much that sort of anterior reach versus straight down cleans up some of our adults. When it doesn't, the kids fall apart, collapse out of that. The adults almost stiffen up to it. I can't figure out why. I haven't done it enough times to have a really solid opinion one way or the other about why that is the way that it is. But again, you go back to this how strong is strong idea. This is Amanda Pelkey. That's a 60. She's about, what?
She's like my height.
Yeah, she's your height. She's about $130, maybe right around there. So you're looking at someone like that who's at probably 25% of body weight relatively easily for 5. So we've got to be looking at that and saying, when we're looking at our adult males. No, actually 50. What am I saying? 50% of body weight. Excuse me, closer to. So you start looking at our adult males and realizing a 200-pound guy should be banging out 100, and when we don't get that, that's another one of those when I think how strong is strong. I think we've got a long way to go in the one-leg, straight-leg deadlift category in terms of moving our better athletes along in that hip extension continuum. I think the kids are very inclined to pick up a heavy trap bar, but not as inclined to do this. And that's why I love these clips, because when I talk to guy groups, a lot of times that's the first thing I'll say is, are you stronger than these girls? And when you start looking, and a lot of the things that we're doing, like chin-ups, most guys aren't stronger than these girls, regardless of strength to body weight ratio. They just can't do, most guys can't do 45 for 7, and Alex can. So regardless of what you weigh, you're not stronger than her. Much less looking at it and thinking, I should be stronger than her, because obviously, whatever, hormonally, you've got all these perceived advantages. The other thing I would tell you, just to think about this idea, you always do the math. Space, tools, math controls everything. When people, what can you do? I don't know. How much space do you have? How many dumbbells do you have? How many benches do you have? How many racks do you have? What you have will tell you what you can do. You can't do, it goes back to the same, and I use the same analogy all the time, but I had this football coach one time who called me and said, hey, I have, I got 100 football players and 2 squat racks. What do I do? And my answer was definitely not squats. It's like, you can't do it unless you're going to have squatting going on, 6 days a week, and a couple guys do it every day. Otherwise, that's not going to work. You don't have the logistical setup. You better be thinking goblet squats or split squats or one-leg squats, because you can't get 100 guys through 2 racks after school. You don't have the logistics. So we've got to always be thinking that logistics will eventually trump everything else that we're going to do. So that was actually 210. So what I would say for the people in Iceland, hopefully this will help you with this idea of, okay, how do I design my program? How do I set up my phases? How do I periodize? How do I progress? How do I regress? How do I select exercises? How do I put that recipe together? I think I would look at it and say it's a really simple process, and then realize that I just spent 2 hours and 10 minutes on it, so maybe it's not. It's just simple to me. But hopefully it will be simpler to the viewer. So thank Thank you. And thank you to those of you who just sat here for 2 hours and gave me an audience so that I wasn't talking to myself. This would have been much harder to do faking it, which I did do once, but